Margaret Ellen Porter walked into the fancy restaurant wearing her best Sunday dress. It was a simple blue cotton dress with small white flowers. She had bought it 3 years ago from a discount store in her small town. Her gray hair was neatly combed, and she wore her late husband's watch on her wrist. The watch was old and scratched, but it still worked perfectly. The restaurant was called La Maison d'Or, which meant the House of Gold in French. It was the most expensive restaurant in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. White tablecloths covered every table. Waiters wore black suits and moved silently like shadows. The walls were decorated with paintings that probably cost more than Margaret's house. Margaret was 67 years old. She had lived her whole life in a small farming town called Millbrook. Her husband Harold had passed away 5 years ago. They had never been rich, but they had been happy. Harold had worked as a mechanic, and Margaret had been a school cafeteria cook for 35 years. She had fed thousands of children over those years. Some of those children were now doctors, lawyers, and business owners. Today was special. Margaret's granddaughter Emily was getting married in 3 days. Emily had asked her grandmother to come to the city early. She wanted to spend time with her before the wedding. Emily was a successful lawyer now. She had made reservations at this fancy restaurant to treat her grandmother to a nice meal. But Emily was running late. A phone call had come just as they were leaving the hotel. An important client needed help with something urgent. Emily had apologized many times and promised to be there in 30 minutes. She had called the restaurant to let them know. She had asked them to seat her grandmother and make her comfortable. Margaret stood at the entrance, waiting. A tall man with slicked back hair stood behind a wooden podium. His name tag said Felipe, and he was the host. He looked at Margaret with cold eyes. His gaze moved slowly from her simple dress to her worn shoes. His lips curved into a small, unpleasant smile. "May I help you?" Felipe asked. His voice sounded like he was doing her a great favor by speaking to her. "Yes, please." "I have a reservation. It should be under Porter. My granddaughter made it." Felipe looked down at his book. He took a very long time. Margaret waited patiently. She had learned patience from years of dealing with hungry children and long cafeteria lines. "I see the reservation," Felipe finally said. "But your granddaughter is not here?" She called ahead. "She said she would be a little late. She asked if you could seat me." Felipe made a face like he had tasted something sour. "I see. Well, we normally do not seat incomplete parties." "This is a maison d'or. Not some common diner." Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept her voice calm. "I understand. But she did call. Perhaps you could make an exception." A woman standing nearby had been listening. She was thin and wore a dress that probably cost as much as Margaret's car. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Diamond earrings sparkled in her ears. She whispered something to her husband, a large man in an expensive suit. They both laughed quietly. Felipe sighed heavily, like Margaret was causing him great trouble. "Very well. Follow me. I will seat you." He led her through the restaurant. They walked past beautiful tables near the windows. They walked past cozy booths with soft lighting. They kept walking until they reached the very back of the restaurant. Near the kitchen door. Near the restrooms. It was the worst table in the entire place. "Here you are," Felipe said. He pulled out a chair. The chair wobbled slightly. Margaret sat down without complaint. She had learned long ago that complaining rarely helped anything. Besides, she was here to wait for Emily. The location of the table did not matter much. A young waiter came over. He was maybe 20 years old with nervous eyes. His name tag said Lucas. He seemed kinder than Felipe. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" "Just water, please." "Thank you, Lucas." The young man smiled at her. It was a real smile, not a fake one. Of course! I'll be right back. Margaret looked around the restaurant. The other customers were all dressed in expensive clothes. The women wore jewelry that sparkled. The men wore watches that probably cost more than Margaret's entire savings. Nobody looked at her. It was like she was invisible! Or maybe they just did not want to see her. She did not mind. She thought about Emily and how proud she was of her granddaughter. Emily had grown up in Millbrook too. She had been a shy girl who loved books. Margaret had fed her countless meals in the school cafeteria. She had always given Emily extra portions because the girl was so thin. Now, Emily was a partner at a big law firm. She had worked so hard to get there. Margaret remembered when Emily had struggled to pay for law school. The family had helped as much as they could. Margaret had sent money from her small pension every month. It was not much, but every little bit helped. Lucas returned with the water. He also brought a basket of bread. The bread is fresh from the oven, he said. Our kitchen makes it every morning. That smells wonderful. Thank you. After Lucas left, Margaret noticed a thin woman with the diamonds walking toward the restroom. She had to pass by Margaret's table. As she walked by, she wrinkled her nose. Honestly, the woman said to her companion who had followed her, they let anyone in here these days? Standards are certainly falling. Margaret heard every word. The woman had not even tried to speak quietly. Margaret took a sip of water. She did not respond. She had faced unkind words before. Working in a school cafeteria, you heard all sorts of things from children who did not know better. And sometimes from adults who should have known better. A few minutes later, a group of men in suits came into the restaurant. They were loud and laughing. Philippe greeted them warmly. He led them to one of the best tables by the window. Margaret watched as he pulled out chairs for them with great care. These chairs did not wobble. One of the men noticed Margaret looking. He leaned over to his friends and said something. They all looked at her and laughed. Margaret turned away. She focused on the bread. It really was very good. Time passed slowly. Margaret checked Harold's old watch. Emily would arrive soon. She ate a piece of bread and drank her water. Lucas came by to refill her glass twice. Each time, he asked if she was comfortable. Each time, she said yes. Then Felipe approached her table. His face wore that sour expression again. Madam, I must ask. Your granddaughter has still not arrived. We have many customers waiting for tables. Perhaps you would like to wait in the lobby instead? Margaret looked around. The restaurant was not full. There were several empty tables, better tables than hers. I would prefer to wait here. Thank you. My granddaughter will be here shortly! Philippe pressed his thin lips together. I see. Well, I must inform you that we require all guests to order something from the menu. We cannot have people simply occupying tables. Of course. May I see the menu, please? Felipe handed her a menu. It was large and heavy. The prices were not listed. Margaret knew what that meant. It meant the food was very expensive. It meant the restaurant thought if you had to ask the price, you could not afford it. Margaret opened the menu. The food descriptions were written in French, with small English explanations below. Foie gras, beef bo, gignon, lobster, thermidor. She did not know what half of these things were, but she was not scared. She had cooked simple food for 35 years. Good food did not need fancy names. I'll have the soup, please, she said. The French onion soup. Felipe raised an eyebrow. Just the soup? Yes. Just the soup. I am waiting for my granddaughter to order the main course. Very well. Felipe took the menu back with obvious disappointment. He had probably hoped she would leave. Margaret sat back in her wobbly chair. She smiled to herself. She had weathered worse than a rude host and snobby customers. She had raised 2 children during hard times. She had buried her husband with dignity and grace. She had fed thousands of hungry children with love and care. A simple woman, some might say, but simple did not mean weak. Simple did not mean foolish. Simple meant she knew what mattered in life. And what mattered was not fancy restaurants or expensive clothes or diamond earrings. What mattered was love. What mattered was kindness. What mattered was the people you held dear. Emily would be here soon, and when she arrived, everything would be fine. Margaret was sure of it. She just did not know how fine things would actually become. The thin woman with the diamonds returned from the restroom. This time, she stopped right next to Margaret's table. Her perfume was strong and unpleasant. "Excuse me," the woman said. Her voice was loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "But are you lost? The soup kitchen is several blocks away." A few people laughed. Margaret looked up at the woman. She saw expensive clothes and fancy jewelry, but she also saw something sad in the woman's eyes. Something empty. "Thank you for your concern," Margaret said calmly, "but I am exactly where I should be." The woman made a huffing sound and walked away. Her heels clicked loudly on the marble floor. Margaret turned back to watch the entrance. Any minute now, Emily would walk through those doors, and then everything would change. Lucas brought her soup. He set it down gently. "Here you go, ma'am. Be careful. It's hot." "Thank you, Lucas. You have been very kind." The young waiter blushed. "It's nothing, ma'am. Just doing my job." "No," Margaret said. "Kindness is never nothing. Remember that?" Lucas nodded slowly. Something in her words seemed to touch him. He walked away, looking thoughtful. Margaret tasted the soup. It was good. Not as good as the soup she made at home, but good enough. She ate slowly, enjoying each spoonful. She watched the restaurant and its fancy customers. She thought about her life and all the meals she had served. 35 years. Thousands of children. Countless soups and sandwiches and casseroles. It had not made her rich. It had not made her famous. But it had made her happy. And now one of those children she had fed was about to walk through the door. Not as a child anymore. As a successful woman. A lawyer. A partner at a major firm. Margaret smiled and ate her soup. The clock on the wall showed that 30 minutes had passed. Emily would be here any moment. And Margaret could not wait to see what would happen next. The front doors of Lamasin door opened. Margaret looked up from her soup with hope in her eyes. But it was not Emily who walked in. It was another wealthy couple, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people earned in a month. Margaret sighed softly and returned to her soup. She had learned patience long ago. Working in a school cafeteria had taught her that good things came to those who waited. Children who were patient got their food hot. Children who pushed and shoved often dropped their trays. The restaurant was getting busier now. The lunch crowd was arriving. Business people in expensive suits. Ladies who lunched with their designer handbags. Everyone seemed to know each other. They kissed cheeks and shook hands and made deals over bottles of wine that cost hundreds of dollars. Nobody noticed Margaret in her corner by the kitchen door. She was invisible to them. Just an old woman in a cheap dress, eating soup alone. Not worth their time or attention. Felipe walked past her table several times. Each time he looked at her like she was a stain on his clean tablecloth. He never said anything directly, but his message was clear. She did not belong here. She should leave. Margaret ignored him. She had faced worse in her life. Much worse. She remembered the year the factory closed in Millbrook. Half the town lost their jobs overnight. Parents could not afford to pay for school lunches anymore. Children came to the cafeteria with empty hands and hungry eyes. Margaret had talked to the school principal. She had gone to the town council. She had organized donations from local farms and businesses. For 3 years, no child in Millbrook went hungry at school. Margaret made sure of it. She stretched every dollar and every donation as far as it could go. Nobody gave her an award. Nobody wrote articles about her in fancy magazines. But the children knew. The parents knew. That was enough. Now, Margaret sat in this fancy restaurant being looked down upon by people who had never known real struggle. People who thought having money made them better than others. People who measured worth in dollars and cents. She felt sorry for them, in a way. They would never know the joy of feeding a hungry child. They would never feel the warmth of a grateful hug from a parent who could not afford groceries. They would never understand that the best things in life could not be bought. Lucas came by to check on her again. He was the only person in this restaurant who showed her any real kindness. Is everything all right, ma'am? Can I get you anything else? I'm fine, dear. Thank you for asking. You're very good at your job. Lucas glanced around nervously. I try my best. Felipe says, I still have a lot to learn. Don't listen too much to Felipe, Margaret said gently. He might know about fancy restaurants, but he doesn't know much about people. The young waiter looked surprised. Then he smiled. You might be right about that, ma'am. He hurried away as Felipe shot him a stern look from across the room. Margaret checked Harold's watch again. Emily was very late now. Something must be keeping her at work. That was fine. Margaret understood. Emily had important responsibilities. People depended on her. The thin woman with the diamonds was now seated at a table nearby, close enough for Margaret to hear her conversation. The woman was talking loudly about her vacation home in the south of France. Her companion, another wealthy-looking woman, was talking about the jewelry her husband had bought her for their anniversary. Diamonds are nice, the thin woman said, but I prefer sapphires. More unique, you know? Oh, I agree completely. Anyone can have diamonds these days. They both laughed as if they had said something very clever. Margaret thought about the only jewelry she owned, her wedding ring. A simple gold band that Harold had saved for 6 months to buy. The watch on her wrist, given to Harold by his father. A pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, now given to Emily for her wedding. These things were not expensive, but they were priceless, because they held memories and love and history. No sapphire from a south of France vacation could ever match that. The restaurant doors opened again. This time, Margaret's heart jumped. A young woman with dark hair was walking in, but no, it was not Emily. This woman was taller and wore different clothes. Margaret settled back into her chair. She would wait. She was good at waiting. A commotion near the entrance caught her attention. A group of men in suits were arriving. They were greeted like royalty by Philippe. Handshakes and smiles and warm words. They were led to a private room in the back, even further from Margaret than where she sat. She heard one of the waiters whisper to Lucas, "That's the Harrison group. They spend thousands here every week." Felipe loves them. Lucas nodded but said nothing. Margaret understood now. In this restaurant, your treatment depended on your wallet. Money talked. Everything else was invisible. It made her sad to think about it. What kind of world had been created where people were valued only for what they could spend? Where kindness was given to the rich and coldness to the poor? She finished her soup. It had been good, but not worth what they probably charged for it. She had made better soup in her school cafeteria. Soup made with love and care and the knowledge that hungry children were waiting. Felipe appeared at her table again. His face was even sourer than before. "Madam, your granddaughter has still not arrived. I must ask you to either order more food or give up your table. We have paying customers waiting." Margaret looked around. There were still empty tables. Better tables than hers. But she did not argue. I will wait a little longer. Please. My granddaughter should be here any moment. This is most irregular. Filipa Hafudo. We simply cannot have people occupying tables for hours without ordering. I ordered soup. A bowl of soup. Yes, our least expensive item. He said this like it was something shameful. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. Getting angry would not help. It never did. I am waiting for my granddaughter, she said firmly. She made a reservation. She called ahead. I am a guest, and I will wait for her. Filipa looked like he wanted to say more, but something in Margaret's eyes stopped him. She had faced down angry parents, troubled teenagers, and budget-cutting administrators for 35 years. She was not afraid of a snooty restaurant host. Very well, he said through clenched teeth. But if she does not arrive soon, I will have to ask you to leave. He walked away. His back was stiff with anger. The thin woman with the diamonds had watched the whole exchange. She leaned over to her friend and whispered something. They both looked at Margaret and laughed. Margaret pretended not to notice. But inside, she felt tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. Tired of being looked down upon. Tired of being treated like she was less than human just because she did not have fancy clothes or expensive jewelry. She thought about all the children she had served over the years. Some of those children came from wealthy families. They had nice clothes and full lunch accounts. Other children came from poor families. They wore second-hand clothes and relied on free lunch programs. Margaret had treated them all the same. Every child got a warm smile with their meal. Every child was asked how their day was going. Every child was reminded to eat their vegetables and to be kind to each other. She had never judged a child by their parents' bank account. She had never given bigger portions to rich kids or smaller portions to poor kids. Food was food. Hunger was hunger. Children were children. Why couldn't adults understand this simple truth? Lucas appeared at her table again. This time, he looked worried. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but Felipe is really upset. Is there anything I can do? Maybe call your granddaughter? Margaret smiled at his kindness. Thank you, Lucas, but I'm sure she'll be here soon. She's a very busy woman. Important work. What does she do? She's a lawyer, a partner at a big firm. Lucas's eyes widened. A partner? That's impressive. Yes, it is. I'm very proud of her. I used to feed her in my school cafeteria when she was just a little girl. Now look at her. The young waiter seemed genuinely interested. You worked in a school cafeteria? For 35 years. Best job I ever had? Wow. That's a long time. Did you like it? Margaret's eyes grew warm with memories. I loved it. Every single day. Feeding hungry children is the most important work in the world, Lucas. Without food, children cannot learn. Without learning, children cannot grow. Without growth, children cannot become the people they were meant to be. Lucas nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking about her words. I never thought about it like that, he said. I always thought working in a cafeteria was, well, not as fancy as working in a place like this. He looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean don't apologize. You're right. Working in a school cafeteria is not fancy. The pay is low. The hours are long. Nobody takes pictures of school lunch for fancy magazines. But it matters. It matters more than all the expensive food and all the fancy restaurants in the world. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. I think I understand, he said. My grandmother used to say something similar. She worked in a hospital kitchen for years. She always said she was feeding people back to health. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She passed away last year. I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you. Lucas paused. You remind me of her, actually. The way you talk. The way you don't let Felipe bother you! Margaret reached out and patted his hand. Thank you, Lucas! That's the nicest thing anyone has said to me all day! A sharp voice cut through the moment. Felipe was calling Lucas from across the room. The young waiter hurried away with an apologetic look. Margaret sat alone again, but she did not feel alone anymore. That brief conversation with Lucas had reminded her of something important. Good people existed everywhere. Even in fancy restaurants where she was not welcome. The doors opened once more. Margaret looked up, and this time her heart soared. Emily was walking through the doors, but she was not alone. Behind Emily walked several other people. Important-looking people. People in expensive suits and designer dresses. People who looked like they belonged in this restaurant. Felipe rushed forward to greet them. His entire attitude changed. He was smiling now, bowing, almost being as pleasant as could be. Margaret watched with curiosity. What was happening? Emily spotted her grandmother in the back corner. Her face changed. First surprise at where Margaret was seated. Then anger. A deep, burning anger that Margaret had rarely seen in her gentle granddaughter. Emily said something to Felipe. His face went pale. And then Emily began walking toward Margaret. Her heels clicked on the marble floor like a countdown. Behind her, the group of important-looking people followed, and Felipe followed them, looking like a man who had just realized he had made a terrible mistake. Margaret sat up straighter in her wobbly chair. Something was about to happen. Something big. Emily reached her grandmother's table. She bent down and kissed Margaret's cheek. I'm so sorry I'm late. Grandma, work was crazy. That's all right, dear. No, or under, son. No, it's not all right. Emily's voice was tight with controlled anger. It is definitely not all right! She turned to face Felipe, who had stopped a few feet away. His face was no longer pale. It was now a deep, embarrassed red. Mr. Felipe, Emily said. Her voice was calm but cold. Would you like to explain why my grandmother, my guest, was seated at the worst table in your restaurant, next to the kitchen, next to the restrooms? Felipe opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The thin woman with the diamonds had stood up to watch. Her friend was watching too. In fact, the entire restaurant seemed to be watching now. One of the important-looking people behind Emily stepped forward. He was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. Yes, Felipe, the man said. I'd like to hear this explanation too. Margaret noticed that Felipe seemed to shrink at the sound of this man's voice. Mr. Harrison, Felipe stammered. I didn't. That is to say, Mr. Harrison. Margaret remembered hearing the waiters talk about the Harrison group. They spent thousands here every week. Felipe treated them like royalty. Emily spoke again. Mr. Harrison is one of my firm's most important clients. He also happens to be the owner of this restaurant. Margaret's eyes widened. The owner? Felipe looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Emily has told me wonderful stories about her grandmother, Mr. Harrison said. He walked closer to Margaret's table. Mrs. Porter, It's an honor to meet you. Emily says you're the reason she became who she is today. Margaret blushed. Oh, I don't know about that. Emily worked very hard. She also tells me you fed her lunch every day in your school cafeteria, and that you always made sure she had extra portions because she was too thin. Emily smiled at her grandmother. She did. She saved food for me, made sure I never went hungry. Even when times were hard. Times were hard for everyone back then, Margaret said softly. Mr. Harrison turned to Felipe. His face was no longer kind. Felipe, I trusted you to run this restaurant with class and dignity. I trusted you to treat every guest with respect, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. It seems my trust was misplaced. Sir, I don't. Mr. Harrison held up a hand. I don't want to hear excuses. I saw everything. I was watching from the moment Mrs. Porter arrived. Emily asked me to keep an eye on her grandmother while she handled her emergency at work. She wanted to make sure her grandmother was comfortable. Margaret looked at Emily with surprise. Emily had arranged this. Grandma, I know how people can be, Emily said softly. I wanted to make sure you were treated well. I'm sorry I couldn't be here. But you were here, Margaret said. In a way. Mr. Harrison continued speaking to Felipe. I watched you seat this lovely woman at the worst table in the restaurant. I watched you ignore her. I watched you suggest she leave multiple times. I watched your other guests insult her. He glanced at the thin woman with the diamonds, who suddenly found her napkin very interesting. And I watched Mrs. Porter handle it all with grace and dignity. The restaurant was completely silent now. Everyone was listening! Mrs. Porter, Mr. Harrison said, turning back to Margaret, I owe you an apology on behalf of my restaurant. This is not how we treat guests. This is not what I built this place to be. Please don't apologize, Margaret said. You did nothing wrong. Perhaps not personally, but I'm responsible for the people who work here. And Philippa's behavior reflects on me. He looked at the host with disappointment. We'll be having a long conversation later. Philippe! Philippe said nothing. He looked sick. Emily helped her grandmother stand up. Come on, Grandma. Let's move to a proper table. Actually, Mr. Harrison said, I have a better idea. My private dining room is available. I would be honored if you and Mrs. Porter would join me for lunch. My treat? Emily smiled. That's very generous, Mr. Harrison. Please, call me George. Anyone who fed you all those extra portions of lunch has earned my friendship. The group began walking toward the private dining room. Margaret walked with them, still a little confused by everything that was happening. One moment, she was an invisible old woman eating soup alone. The next moment, she was an honored guest of the restaurant's owner. As they walked, they passed the table where the thin woman with the diamonds sat. The woman looked up at Margaret with wide eyes. Her face was pale now. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Margaret stopped. She looked at the woman for a long moment. You know, Margaret said gently, I've met many people like you in my life. People who think money and clothes and jewelry make them better than others. But I've also fed thousands of children. And I've learned something important from those children. The woman waited. Everyone waited. The kindest children were often the ones with the least. The most generous children were often the ones who understood hunger. And the happiest children were the ones who knew that love mattered more than anything else. Margaret paused. I hope you remember that the next time you judge someone by their dress. She walked away. The thin woman said nothing. But Margaret noticed that her eyes had filled with tears. The private dining room was beautiful. Soft lighting. Comfortable chairs. A table set with crystal glasses and silver utensils. But Margaret did not care about any of that. She cared that Emily was sitting beside her, holding her hand. "I'm so proud of you," Margaret whispered to her granddaughter. "You've become such a wonderful person." "I learned from the best," Emily whispered back. Lunch was served. Delicious food that Margaret could not pronounce. Wine that cost more than her monthly grocery bill. But the best part was the conversation. Mr. Harrison asked Margaret about her life, her work, her memories. She told stories about the school cafeteria, about the children she had fed, about the hard times and the good times. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Porter," George Harrison said when she finished a story about organizing food donations during the factory closure. "You've touched more lives than most people could ever dream of." "I just made lunch," Margaret said humbly. "Anyone could do it." "No," George said firmly. "Not anyone. It takes a special person to feed children for 35 years, to care about them, to make sure none of them go hungry. That's not just a job. That's a calling." Emily squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I told you, Grandma, you're more important than you know." After lunch, George Harrison did something unexpected. He called the entire restaurant staff into the private dining room. "Waiters, cooks, dishwashers, hosts, everyone!" including Felipe, who looked like he was walking to his own execution. "I want all of you to meet Mrs. Margaret Porter," George said. "She spent 35 years working in a school cafeteria, feeding children, making sure no child was ever hungry. She did not do this for money or fame. She did it because she cared." The staff listened in silence. "This restaurant is named La Maison d'Or, the House of Gold. But real gold is not found in crystal chandeliers or expensive wine or fancy food. Real gold is found in people like Mrs. Porter, people who give without expecting anything in return. People who treat everyone with kindness and respect." He looked directly at Felipe. "Some of us have forgotten this. Some of us have started treating guests differently based on how they look or how much they might spend. This stops today. Every guest in my restaurant will be treated with dignity. Every guest." "Understood." The staff nodded. Felipe nodded too, though he did not meet George's eyes. "Now," George said, his voice softening, "I want each of you to shake Mrs. Porter's hand. Thank her for what she's taught us today." One by one, the staff came forward. They shook Margaret's hand. Some thanked her. Some apologized. Lucas was last. He hugged her instead of shaking her hand. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you said. I'm going to call my mom tonight. She works in a hospital kitchen. I've never told her how proud I am of her." Margaret's eyes filled with happy tears. That will mean the world to her. When the staff had left, George turned to Felipe. "You will not be fired today," he said. "Mrs. Porter asked me to give you another chance. She said, everyone deserves the opportunity to learn and grow. I am honoring her request. But understand this clearly, Felipe. One more incident like today, and you're gone. No second chances after this." Felipe nodded. He looked at Margaret with something new in his eyes. Respect, shame, probably both. "Mrs. Porter," he said quietly, "I apologize. Truly, you deserved better." "Thank you, Felipe," Margaret said. "Now, show me you mean it. Be kind to everyone who walks through those doors, even the ones in simple dresses and worn shoes." Felipe nodded again. He walked out of the room, looking like a changed man. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But Margaret had given him the chance to be better. That was all anyone could do. The day ended with hugs and promises. George Harrison invited Margaret to come back any time. Emily promised to bring her grandmother to the city more often. Margaret promised to keep being exactly who she was. As they left the restaurant, Margaret paused at the entrance. She looked back at the beautiful room with its chandeliers and white tablecloths. Then she looked at the people inside. Some were still wealthy and snobby. Some were now thinking about what they had seen and heard. And some, like Lucas and even Felipe, might never look at the world the same way again. Margaret smiled. A simple woman from a small town had made a difference in a fancy restaurant in the big city. Not through money or power or influence, through something much more powerful. Through kindness. Through dignity. Through the simple truth that every person mattered. Emily put her arm around her grandmother. Ready to go, Grandma? Yes, dear. I'm ready. They walked out into the sunshine together, grandmother and granddaughter. Two women from a small town called Millbrook. Two women who knew what really mattered in life. The world was full of fancy restaurants and expensive clothes and diamond earrings. But it was also full of school cafeteria workers and hospital kitchen staff and simple people who showed up every day to make the world a little better. Margaret had spent her life being one of those people. And today, she had reminded a few fancy folks what real gold looked like. It looked like kindness. It looked like grace. It looked like a 67-year-old woman in a simple blue dress who had fed thousands of children with love. And it was worth more than all the crystal chandeliers and all the fancy restaurants in the world. 3 days later, Emily's wedding arrived. The ceremony was beautiful. The bride was radiant. But for Margaret, the most memorable moment came during the reception speeches. Emily stood up to speak. She looked around at all her guests, at her new husband, at her family. Then, she looked at her grandmother. Before I thank everyone for coming, Emily began. I need to tell you a story. A story about the most influential person in my life. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. My grandmother worked in a school cafeteria for 35 years. She fed thousands of children, including me. She never made much money. She never got famous. She never ate at fancy restaurants. Some of the guests chuckled. Word had spread about the incident at La Mawson door. But a few days ago, something happened that showed me exactly how important she is. She walked into a fancy restaurant and was treated badly by people who thought she didn't belong. But she handled it with grace, with dignity, with the same kindness she showed to every hungry child who ever came through her cafeteria line. Emily's voice cracked with emotion. And by the end of that lunch, she had taught a restaurant owner, a staff of waiters, and at least one very snooty woman with diamond earrings, a lesson they will never forget. That kindness matters more than money. That dignity has no price tag. That the most important people in the world are often the ones nobody notices. Emily raised her glass. So, I want to propose a toast, not to me and my new husband. Not to fancy clothes or expensive jewelry, but to my grandmother, Margaret Ellen Porter, the cafeteria lady who changed the world, one lunch at a time. The room erupted in applause. Everyone raised their glasses. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. Later, as the reception continued, Margaret found a quiet corner to rest. She was happy, but tired. It had been a big few days. A woman approached her. It took Margaret a moment to recognize her. The thin woman from the restaurant. Without her diamonds tonight. Without her superior attitude. Mrs. Porter? Margaret nodded. I wanted to apologize. What I said at the restaurant. It was cruel and wrong. I've been thinking about it ever since. About what you said about kindness and hunger in children. Have you? Yes? And I've decided to do something to try to make up for how I treated you. Margaret waited. I'm going to volunteer at a school cafeteria. I want to help serve lunch to children. I want to understand what you understood for 35 years. Margaret's eyes widened. Really?